You're listening to Let's Talk Creation, the science podcast that's just for you.
Well, welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Creation, our new podcast. I say new, we're now on episode 13, Todd. Can you believe that? Episode 13.
That's amazing. It is, yeah.
So I'm Paul Garner.
And I'm Todd Wood.
And we are your hosts. And today we're going to be joined by a very special guest who we'll introduce in just a moment. But anyway, Todd, we're just kind of getting back into the swing of recording these episodes again after quite a break away. And one of the things that I'm quite excited about at the moment as we're recording this is that we're about to head into conference season, aren't we?
Yes,
that will kind of be over by the time this goes out. But next week, from our perspective, is the Origins Conference. And that's the annual meeting of the Creation Biology, Geology and Theology Societies. I'm really excited about that. So that's something to look forward to next week. And I guess at some point in the podcast, we may well come back to talk about that.
I think that'll be inevitable. We're probably gonna recruit some people to maybe appear on, I don't know, so maybe we'll do a sort of a conventional interview kind of thing. Maybe we'll do little, little film clips. It could be real different. Whatever we come up with, I don't know. It'll happen in the unknown future. But
we don't know what we're doing. We just muddle our way through. We're
just making this up as we go along. Who knows?
That's right.
So
it's more fun that way.
Yeah, it is more fun that way. And we'll as we listen into the talks, we'll say that sounds like a really good thing we should follow up on, and we'll probably do that. So yeah.
So coming back to today's episode, we thought it would be great to have an episode where we talked about creation care. So environmentalism and, caring for the world in which we live. And so we have invited a very special guest who we're delighted to have with us. And that is Tom Hennigan from Truett-McConnell University in Georgia. Tom, it's really great to have you here today.
Paul, it's really great to be here today. Thank you for having me.
We're delighted. And Tom, I thought that it would be good to begin just by introducing you to our listeners. You teach biology at Truett-McConnell. I've known you, Tom, for quite a number of years through sort of attending the creation biology meetings. But some of our listeners may know you from reading this book, the Ecology book, co-authored with Gene Leitner. And I read this recently and really, really enjoyed it. And of course, it's on the topic that we're going to talk about today. You're the author of lots of other articles in creation journals and creation magazines. So why don't you just begin by telling us a bit more about yourself, and perhaps a little bit of your own personal story, your Christian testimony, and then how you got interested in these kinds of topics in particular.
Sounds good. Well, normally I start with a story when I was in Cub Scouts. And my father came and we went out camping for the very first time. I was probably 8 or 9. And at the end of the trip, my father told me, I can't remember all of this, that he saw me crying over in the, next to the cars or somewhere. And he came up to me and said, Tommy, is everything okay? I mean, we're going home and everything. And I'm crying and saying, I don't want to go home. And so that was my first time really in the woods. And it was a really special time. I grew up pretty angrily. There's a lot of reasons for that. I was miserable. And one of the places I found respite was the woods, the forest. And so over time, when I was in a forest ranger school, I'd been learning the perspective of evolution. I was really getting into that information and that knowledge. I really felt like I had a handle on the world and how we came to be. And then a couple of Christian guys during a field trip we were on decided one night to start up the scientific case for a creator. I had never heard such a thing before. I don't even remember what they were talking about now. That was almost 40 years ago. And so, but what I do remember is not being able to sleep that night. And while I was basically wanting to be, I don't know if anybody remembers Grizzly Adams from the 70s. This was the guy that wanted just living in the woods with the bear. That's what I wanted to be. Evolutionist. I mean, I know none of this surprises you, right? And didn't want anything to do with people. That night, I could not sleep because I'd never heard of such a thing, scientific case for creator. My whole worldview was rocked. And so the next day, we were supposed to travel back from the field trip. We were coming from New York. We spent a week in North Carolina to observe forestry practices. We were supposed to go Sunday, but these two Christian guys asked, can we go home Saturday? Can we go home a day early? Because we get a whole spring break time, and maybe we can get some more time if we can get home earlier. So the professor said, don't know if that's going to happen. And then turns out we were able to go on standby. We were going from Charlotte to Atlanta. When we got to Atlanta, it was one of those situations where there was no way. I mean, it was crowded. First time I'd ever been to South. And I was a nervous wreck. And so these two Christian guys that had been talking about the case for the creator the night before, they had this smile on their face. They were at peace. They were just praying. We're all going to make it. There's four of us decided to want to leave early. And so in Atlanta, about a half hour before the flight, the lady calls the four of us up and says, guys, there's only room for three of you. One of you are going to have to stay behind. And so we drew straws. One guy lost. The Christian guy, name's Dave, he just walked away, prayed, came back with a smile on his face. Don't worry, we're all going to be there. I believe God wants us to get home. And I said, if we get home, I will go to church with you on Sunday. This is just, 24 hours after that conversation. Okay, we'll pick you up. And so the lady calls us about 10 minutes before the flight, huddles us and says, I really felt sorry for you guys. I'm going to put your buddy on the first class section. He doesn't have to pay any extra. All's well. And we got home. Turns out that there was a freak snowstorm that kept the rest of our class there for a couple of extra days. Needless to say, I was picked up Sunday. I went to church, and the pastor dropped the sermon and decided to say, basically, I believe someone here needs to know Jesus. And I thought he was talking about me. And so it was one of those heavily convicting, I didn't know what was going on at the time, but heavily convicting times. Had the invitation, calls up, anybody wants to give their life to Jesus. I refused, but I was so overwhelmed, I ended up going into the forest that night and speaking into the darkness and saying, Jesus, if you're real. Okay. But then that began a 5 or 6 year period of time to figure out everything I had been taught about evolution. How does this now tie in to Scripture? It was a very painful process. I was going from this biocentric, all animals are equal, to an ecocentric perspective where, everything's connected. And then I thought, wait a minute, there's more to this than that. How does God fit into this idea of ecology and environment and nature? And can I still care about it as a Christian? And so that is kind of the very brief background as to where I'm coming from today. I just love learning about not only the design of things, but how we can use them. And, so I'm very interested in medicines and food, and I know we'll get into all this later, but yeah. That's the gist.
That's great. I mean, that's a fantastic story. That's a very compelling story. And, God can speak to us in the forest as well as in church, right?
That's right.
That's for sure.
That's especially in the forest.
Exactly. Yeah. Perhaps especially in the forest. Yeah. That's great. So we want to sort of delve into this whole question of, our concern for the world that God has made. But I guess a fundamental sort of question might be, why should we care? We're perhaps used as Christians to thinking about future things and recognizing that this world is ultimately passing away and is transitory. And so a lot of Christians just say, why should we bother? Why should we be concerned with these kinds of worldly endeavors when we should be thinking about spiritual things? We should be thinking about evangelism and outreach and teaching people the Bible and things of eternal significance, and not getting tied up with, concern for the environment. But how would you respond to that? But
especially if the earth is going to burn up anyway, why bother, right?
Right.
That's Revelation. Right? That is a multi-faceted question. From my perspective, I guess I would start in Genesis chapter 1, when verses 26 to 31, when God is saying, let us make man in our image and in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, birds of the air, and so on. And we begin to read about this thing called the dominion mandate. And then you start thinking about, well, what does the image of God mean? And theologians have been talking about that for centuries, but if I were to maybe just keep it simple for now, there's this aspect of representing God on the planet. This is what sets us apart. This is who we are, not what we do. And so this image bearing is representing God for one another and representing God to creation. And so, as far as I know from Scripture, that mandate has not been revoked. Image bearing minimally has to do with representing Him. And because He's called us to have dominion over the fish of the sea, birds of the air, livestock, nature, it's meant that we would rule or take care of His stuff as He would take care of it. Lynn White back in the 60s wrote this article about these words, subduing and dominion and all the rest of it. And it's almost like rape and pillage. And he was pointing this out because those words can be used in another context of war and others in the Old Testament. But in this context, all was very good. And because it's God's stuff and God seems to care about His stuff, He wants us to care for it in His stead. And so the fact that He has provided these wonderful resources for us, medicines and food and beauty, we can go on and on and on in a conversation if you want. Those are some of the things that I think about as to why we should care.
And I think this is a very important point that you're making, isn't it? Because so often this concept of dominion is misunderstood, perhaps sometimes willfully misunderstood, to mean exploitation.
Yes.
As if the Christian position is that, because this world is transitory and because it was made for us, it was, we are given rule and dominion over the creation. We can just use it however we like, and we can kind of just trash it, and
right,
exploit it in a an unwise and ungodly way. And that is not what the Bible is telling us to do, is it?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Because when you think about how He cares for us as Shepherd King, and how He had made this place specifically for us because He was loving on us and wanted it to be a healthy, carefree, at least in the beginning, kind of a place where that is hugely important. And then when we come to Romans and we see that His invisible qualities are seen in the visible creation, we have a whole class we teach it through it, talking about where we see these invisible qualities in creation. And students are saying, whoa, we never thought of it from that perspective before. That's all the more reason to care for it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, let me. I'm gonna play a part here, and I want to emphasize at the beginning, this is me playing a part. These are not my opinions, but these are opinions that I have heard from certain wings of the church. So one of them already was Paul sort of expressed that this idea that, you know, we're not called to do this stuff. We should be, you know, this place is going to burn. We should be concerned with saving souls and not with saving the environment. Another concern that I hear a lot about, and this, and to some extent I do sort of share this, we're kind of getting in bed with some pretty wacky characters, right? So you can take this idea of creation care to some really wild extremes where you have, you know, humans are a virus that need to be eradicated from the planet, and all species are equal, and having a pet is slavery, and eating a cow is murder, and all this stuff. And I sometimes, you know, I hear that and I think, well, you know, you don't have to go that far. Obviously, you don't have to go that far. But at the same time, there does seem to be some concern here that there are some really environmentalists can run amok and do some and you know, become environmental terrorists, really, and do some terrible things and be terrible people and have really kooky ideas. What do you say to that? Is that what you're saying that we should do? We should go out and hug trees and never have a pet again? Is that truly creation care in the biblical sense?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
So, where do I begin?
Yeah, where do you begin?
You like to play this curmudgeon, don't you?
Well, you know, I'm good at it.
Yes, you are. Very good. Yes, you are. We could start by distinguishing environmentalism from creation care. Let me start by that, if that's okay, because they're not the same necessarily. When we look at environmentalism, you can see things like social justice, eco-justice, eco-terrorism. And some definitions can be anywhere from preserving environment, restoring the environment, improving the environment. But there's all kinds of categories, all kinds of people. Someone by the name of Cat Lincoln actually tried to divide environmentalists in 3 types of green, for example. Light green are the types that maybe, you know, hang their laundry out and let the wind blow dry them. They might be ones that are buying organic. They just love nature. There's the dark green. That's the radical, political, humans are a virus wing of environmentalism. There's the bright green, where, you know, these people want radical change, but they try to change the system politically. Economic systems, find ways to change people's behavior. So we want our sociologists involved and so on and so forth. But some of the main commonalities across the board that I have found, most are pantheistic, polytheistic, nature worshiper types. Not everybody. Many are evolutionary in their worldview. So the earth is sacred. Many of these natural religions, like neo-paganism, which really covers a lot of religions, they tend to be not dogmatic, nature worshiping, things like that. And but the key thing here is that in environmentalism, there is no necessarily creator God that's in charge, so it's up to us to fix it. And so with that idea, creation care is different. Creation care is that we understand that there is a creator God, Jesus Christ, Father, Son, and Spirit, that created everything, that he is the one that has set the guidelines in place. It is his world and his universe. Because we're created in his image, we're to represent him and take care of it so that he gets glory. And so he's given us permission to eat meat. He's given us permission to have pets. Well, I don't know that I can find a scripture specifically. Well, yeah, there's some proverb scripture about treating your animals well and things like that.
Yeah.
And so these are the kind of things that we find in creation care and they're his things. And so we know things are going to burn up, but that's because of him. He has the right to do whatever he wants with this world, and there are reasons for what he's going to do in terms of salvation and renewal and all the rest of it. But creation care and environmentalism are really two separate things.
That's very helpful. Well, I was going to say that's extremely helpful, and I think it's about where we, what our foundations are and where we place the emphasis on these things. So, for example, a lot of people talk about animal rights. I struggle with that concept of animal rights in a kind of Christian worldview, but I am big on animal welfare, right? We as God's stewards have a responsibility to our animals, to wild animals, to domestic animals, to farm animals. We have a duty of care and responsibility.
Absolutely.
And so I think welfare perhaps sort of puts the emphasis in the right place. But yes, that's extremely interesting.
Yes, it does.
So there are.
I was going to say that's
go
a
ahead.
really good point. Good point, Paul, because there's a big difference between animal rights and welfare. Welfare is very biblical. We see scriptures like that, God saying in Proverbs about taking good care of your animals and things like that. But then there are other places, I believe in Europe, I don't know if you're seeing this much on the news, but many want to offer plants rights as well. And so one might argue, well, which do animals offer rights to one another, number one, and what animal or plant is representing them in court? And of course, you need a human to represent in court. So have you seen that in terms of the plant rights as well?
No, I haven't come across that.
Okay.
It doesn't surprise me.
There too. Yeah.
Yeah, well, soon we'll have fungus and amoeba rights as well. So
that's right.
Watch what you drink.
That's right.
Yeah. Now, we do here in the UK have an organisation called Extinction Rebellion, which I think has branches in other countries around the world.
Yes.
And I guess you have similar sort of movements in the United States. And they make a lot of very extreme sort of claims, that we're all heading for extinction in 50 years' time or whatever it is. Billions of people are going to die, and they engage in a lot of acts of civil disobedience because they want to kind of essentially bring down this sort of system that they see as leading to disaster. And a lot of young people here in the UK, that resonates with them, and they kind of get on board with movements like that. And I guess as Christians we have environmental concerns, but we have a very distinctive approach, I think.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm sort of getting to is, how do we negotiate, first of all, how we avoid the extremes of either, as we've already said, just neglecting the environment or exploiting the environment, but also not falling into this extreme where you're essentially sort of worshipping nature, or it's kind of making these wild claims, which really are not supported by the scientific data.
That's right.
How do we kind of navigate that? And also, how do we work with people who don't share our convictions on some core things, our Christianity or our creationism, and yet perhaps we do have some common concerns, and we want to sort of engage in co-belligerence on certain environmental concerns? How do we negotiate all of that? It's really a complex area, isn't it?
It is a very complex area. Let's start with, how do we have these conversations? This is one of my concerns in this culture and society today, that we have our tribal perspectives. We're not listening to each other. We have views that we don't want to hear an alternative point of view. And so I love bringing this up with my students, because in this place, I want them to be able to be free to share their opinions, and then encourage, before making opinions, can we sit down and look at the data? And let's look at all the data. Let's look to see what these people are saying. Let's look to see what these people are saying. are we looking at all of the data, or the data being cherry picked? Can we agree to disagree with one another? The issue for me, I think, is how can we get people to just sit and talk and listen to one another? And whether they're atheists, whether they're dark green environmentalists that want to tear the systems down, can we at least sit down and talk and try to understand? Let me give you an example. I teach a lot around here at our local nature centers, which will tie into your next question. How do we work with people like this? And I was sharing about bears. I know that surprises you. So I was talking about bears, and there was a journalist there that was going to report on this particular class. At the end of the class, the journalist had heard that I was from Truett. And so they thought, hey, at the end, did you have to sign some kind of document where you had to reject evolution or something like that? And she's coming from a Jewish liberal perspective. And I'm saying, no, not at all. It was we had to sign other things about some theological things. And so she said, oh, I thought so. And okay, so I was taking a Hebrew class on Genesis, and I haven't been able to have anyone answer this question. She said, what does God have against intelligence and knowledge? And I said, well, what do you mean? Well, Eve and Adam are punished because because they want knowledge or something like that. And I don't understand that. And I said, oh, I see what you're saying. No. Eve and Adam were suffering consequences of their rebellion. If you think about it, I think the human brain is probably the most complex biological substance in the universe, as far as we know.
Yeah.
And if there was a God that created that, then he'd probably want us to use it. And she said, I never thought of that before. Why can't more people like you and I just be able to sit down and talk to one another without arguing? And I'm saying that's a great question. And we had a great conversation. And what we had commonalities with was the fact that we both enjoyed bears and nature and stewardship. And that's why part of the reasons I volunteer around here. There are other things that I do too, but one of the reasons I volunteer is that if I can get a chance to share my faith, then I can do that, because how many places can you find Christians medicating hemlock trees, talking about bears, and working with wolves? And so talk about evangelism, sharing the gospel. What a wonderful people group to think about. No one ever talks about environmentalists as a people group.
Yeah,
that's what I'm about.
True.
Yeah, they're not just ideological enemies, right? They're people who need Jesus as well. It sounds like you've got a really pretty powerful mission field, I guess. I mean, I can't think of any other way that sort of Christians and hardcore liberals would sort of fall in together.
That's right.
Working together on something.
Right. I don't have a ton of examples of where I got a chance to share the gospel, but they know where I'm coming from. They know where I am. And sometimes they comment like, it's amazing that you're here. It's like, we didn't think Christians cared about that stuff. And we should, if you think about it, just from what we've shared about. I mean, God has given us dominion, and what better way to represent Jesus than working alongside with others that have a commonality of caring for nature.
Yeah. And ultimately, of course, as I often like to remind people, there's going to be a new heavens and a new earth. But really, that's a renewed heavens and earth. God is in the renovation business, right? He's in the conservation business. It's not as if there's some radical discontinuity between the creation that there is now and the creation to come. It's going to be a renewed creation. And if God is in the renewal business, then perhaps we should be too.
Absolutely. Great point.
Well, that's probably a good place just to break. We're going to go to one or two ads, and then we'll be back in just a moment's time.
All right.
Are you confused about creation and evolution? Are you intimidated by people who tell you that only morons believe in creationism and that evolution is a proven fact? What if these challenges aren't merely problems to be solved, but an opportunity or an invitation to a lifetime of discipleship seeking God? This is the subject of The Quest, Exploring Creation's Hardest Problems, a book written by me, Todd Wood, and it presents a unique perspective on creation and evolution that encourages faith, commitment, and curiosity in the face of uncertainty. Science and biblical creation walk hand in hand as we explore God's creation. God calls us to experience the joy of questions and the beauty of His handiwork on the quest. It's available today at coursei.org/quest.
Okay, well, welcome back to part 2 of this fascinating discussion that we're having here today with Tom Hennigan from Truett McConnell University about creation care. Tom, before we sort of get back into the topic, I've got a comment on your T-shirt. Now, you've mentioned a couple of times that you're interested in bears, so just show us your shirt there and tell us what that's about.
I don't know how well you can see it. We've got a picture of Ted the bear. Ted Bear is from the North American Bear Center in Minnesota. I've had a chance to meet him and interact with him. He loves grapes, by the way. And so he's been a captive bear all of his life. And he was donated to them. He's old now. He's probably 20 anyway. He's probably been the biggest black bear in North America because not because of anything except for that he's spoiled rotten. He was over 1,000 pounds at one point. Now, bears are designed to put fat on, but not that much fat. So the vet came and said, got to get some weight off this guy. So we'll feed him grapes, and he puts the grapes on the palm, and he just takes one grape at a time with his tongue. And on the shirt, it's called Advice from Ted Bear. And the advice is be gentle, live large, take it slow, eat plenty of grapes, get along with others, enjoy naps, and when life gets hairy, grin and bear it.
Good advice. Yeah, that's good.
Boy.
Good
Nothing like a good bear pun, is there?
Yeah, that's right. Oh, very good. Yeah, excellent. And yeah, I mean, you've published some stuff on bears too, about sort of bear hybrids and things like that. So
yes.
People can look that up. Okay, coming back to sort of creation care again, what do you think are some of the big sort of issues, the major kind of environmental concerns that confront us at the present time? And we can be fairly wide-ranging, I think, here, because there are obviously some topics that tend to dominate the discussion. But there are a whole load of other things that perhaps sometimes get overlooked or neglected. So what do you think some of those things are, Tom?
Okay, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention climate change briefly. Climate change is one of those issues that are taking front and center, as we all know, in news and in politics. And no one's arguing climate change, really, at least those in the field. Climate has been changing forever. From a biblical perspective, we may even argue, Paul, you might have more to say on this, that we're kind of feeling kind of the slight after effects of the flood, possibly. But climate has been changing for a long time. Changing climate is not the issue. The issue is, are we polluting the atmosphere in such a way that we are changing the climate in a deleterious or negative kind of fashion? Now we can, that's one thing. I don't believe that's as big an issue for lots of reasons. We want to get into it as others. So if anybody wants to ask questions now, or we'll come back to it.
I'd like to know what the others are. Do you think are bigger? That's the one I hear about. Oh, that and COVID. Yeah, those are the two big things today. And everybody needs to stop driving their cars and get vaccinated. So what's bigger than that? What could possibly be bigger than that?
See, and that's the problem. The way it comes across and the way it's delivered by politicians and others, when you really start looking at the data, you recognize that man has contributed to some warming in CO2 concentration. We can talk about that. But when we look at all of the data, there are a lot worse issues going on right now, even though that just probably, that for some people watching right now, that probably just doesn't smack of anything logical. But anyway, if we want, we can get back to it. I think more importantly, there are some very water pollution issues, air pollution issues for other reasons, but I would even argue that plastics pollution is probably huge, because I don't know if you're familiar with all that's going on. You've seen the plastic islands maybe in the oceans. We've got microbead issues. We find these in lotions and stuff. These microbeads are getting into even some of the crustaceans at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. There was one crustacean named after, given a new name, recently discovered, having to do with plastics, because they found plastics in this thing. And it's just, things are eating these things, and they're almost microscopic. They're used for skin, helping skin shed and things like that, for other things. And then, when you take a shower, they're basically shampooed into the water systems. But plastics pollution is a huge problem. I show pictures with my students where animals are eating plastics and their stomachs are filled and they die of starvation because they don't have the metabolism to break plastic down and use it. And so plastics is huge, much worse, I believe, than climate change. Another major issue is habitat loss. Habitat loss is a big one. As we change habitat, we're affecting whole ecosystems. It's through building or basically it's building or roads, construction, things like that. We're just being careful, knocking things down, clear cuts, things like that. We can talk about all that kind of stuff. Water pollution is huge. The fish, overfishing, that's a huge one as well. Just because the demand for seafood is so much, we're just having some real issues with seemingly decreasing populations of all kinds of fish, especially due to bycatch. Bycatch is just catching other things that we don't normally eat. But some of the markets in Asia, they eat anything, and so they'll catch and keep anything, whether it's a dolphin, whether it's a whale, whether it's a whatever. And so, as if you've been to any of these markets, they'll have anything there: dogs, cats, seals, whales. So these are some real big issues, and we don't hear much about them.
Yeah.
And of course, habitat loss deals with extinction as well. So we're concerned about populations that are endangered. So all that is, it's all connected. So.
Wow.
What practically then, Tom, in the face of all of this, because we can feel so helpless, can't we? When you talk about the issue with the plastics, there's this huge global problem, where these plastics are getting into the food chain, ultimately into the food that we eat too. So it kind of comes back to bite us, doesn't it? But you can feel so helpless because we're just one tiny cog in this huge sort of mechanism. How can we make a difference? What practically are the things that that your average, Christian or your general sort of member of the public can do, either as an individual or in their families? What can perhaps we do as churches? Not to mention sort of regional, national level. What are the practical things we can do, Tom, to try to help this situation?
Yes, there are lots of things I believe we can do. For example, we know that when we go buy things, the plastic wrappings are just unbelievable. And of course, the plastic bags we use from places like Walmart and other places, those are finding themselves in the ocean. And of course, things like sea turtles look at a floating plastic bag and think of jellyfish or something. And so we're finding sea turtles with stomachs full of plastic bags. Why not get those canvas bags and bring them with you when you go shopping and use those so that you can use and reuse again? That's a practical thing we can do. Community gardens, family gardens, church gardens, where You're teaching kids to understand the whole basic God system, ecological system. At home, for example, we compost. And so we're trying to cut down trash. And so I've got newspaper and paper towels, all that stuff can be composted by our microflora and fauna, our micro critters, so to speak. And it's wonderful to watch them change this stuff into soil. It's probably one of my favorite parts of gardening. And then we don't have to go buy soil. There are things like helping your kids as families get out in the forest or get at the beach, bring nature guides with you. Because we find that the more people care about nature, the more likely they'll want to steward it and care for it in Jesus' name if we're talking about the church. And so it really, I think, is a grassroots thing. It really has to start with the individual, to the family, to the church. I mean, there's a lot of things I could say too. I love there's so many of the kids these days, well, everybody is so plugged in electronically that there's fear of the outdoors, and and they don't want to be outside. And for churches, I think that's a wonderful thing and in my ecology book, we talk about that. How can we do those things? Can I tell a story, real quick story?
Yeah, sure.
I hope this kind of. So I used to work at a biological station in the Adirondacks of New York State, and I would I was teaching the mammals and amphibians and reptiles. And these were for high school students, and it was meant to help them kind of get a flavor of environmental biology. So it was a camp in a way that we would introduce them to the basics, plants, animals, fish, you name it, all this stuff. And then the last half of the week, they would pick a question to investigate and test a basic hypothesis. And so one group wanted to test mammal activity at night and day, but their problem was they were afraid of the dark. And so because there's a lot of fear in the church and other places, the outdoors, I thought, okay, well, let's go do some outside dark training. I will meet you at the cabin at 9 o'clock at night, 9:30 when it gets dark. I want you to leave the flashlights behind, and we're going to plunge into the forest without lights. And I will introduce you to the nightlife. And so I had another teacher there with me, one in the back, one in the front. You should have seen him. They were all together. They were holding each other. They were scuffling down the trail. They were half crying, half laughing in their fear. And suddenly this scream from the forest took place. And it was like, oh, this is like I had planned this. This is wonderful. And it sounded like someone was being killed. Okay. So perfect teachable moment. Turns out I just sat him down on the trail. You hear this, everybody's scared. This is a baby owl. It's a baby barred owl. He's just crying for mama right now. I know it sounds like someone dying out here. And so we spent the next 2 or 3 hours walking. By the end of that trip, they were skipping and singing. We had been telling stories at an old beaver field, basically meadow. And when they got back, they had this wonderful time. One of the girls in the group wrote this beautiful poem about just overcoming fear, interacting with other people, learning about nature in the nighttime. And it made a huge difference to those that were there. And just to have these experiences, one hopes that once you have an experience like that, and it's a good experience, then you'll care maybe. And if you can care, and if you can see it from a Christian perspective, from God's perspective, then, just getting kids out and having those experiences may mean everything. So there's a lot of things I haven't said, but that's a start.
So I got a question. I want to follow up on your advice here. Do you think it's a sin if I go to the store and grab a few things and put them in a plastic bag and take it home and throw it away? Is it a sin for me if I don't compost? Are these specific things sinful? Is this a moral compulsion for me?
Absolutely not. Because the last I heard, sin means basically missing the mark with God. And so I don't remember any sins in there about thou shalt not use plastic. Not at all. Not at all. With Paul's question, it was along the lines of, well, how can I make a difference? Right. What can I do from my part? I know it may not affect the world overall, what I'm doing, but at least I'm doing my part. And so absolutely not. Okay. I know some Christians would say, now you're getting into this tree hugging environmentalist rights and wrongs. And I love your curmudgeon gift. I love that. Anyway, to answer your question, absolutely not. And I don't think there'd be any true judgment. Well, I can't say that. You wouldn't get judged by me because I understand the issues there.
Yeah, it's complicated.
It is complicated.
We live in a complicated culture. I mean, if you want to buy good fresh fruit, you're going to have to probably go to a store unless you live in the country and you have access to that sort of thing.
That's exactly right, and it's a great point because we gotta do what we got to do, and we're limited to what we can do, and so not everyone has a piece of property to have a garden, that kind of thing. So that's a very good point.
Yeah. So let me ask you this follow-up then. Do you think it's sinful, in some sense of the word, to do absolutely nothing consciously to obey the Dominion mandate?
I think there are some allusions potentially in Scripture. Some have used the talent parable, although it's kind of in the context of his return, Matthew chapter 25, but it's a stewardship kind of parable. And so the basic message is, what have you done with the resources while I've been gone? And some have used it that way. I'm not being dogmatic on that. Can be used for an environmental resource ethic kind of thing. But it would seem like, since God doesn't seem to have revoked that particular command, it would seem like we have some responsibility in what we're doing. I mean, are we throwing garbage out the window as we're driving our cars?
Yeah, that's bad. Don't do that.
Yeah. Are we sitting out back with our BB guns plucking birds just to kill them for no reason?
Yeah.
I mean, okay, do we understand how those birds are integral to the system itself and why God made them? I mean, I think there are potentially some consequences there. Because I think if people really thought about them, that these are his, and we're
the caretakers.
Yes. If we're caretaking his stuff, why are we abusing and slaughtering and messing things up without any thought?
So there's also the issue of a concern for neighbor, love for neighbor.
Yes, absolutely.
Which is a huge, that's right there in the commandments, isn't it? Concern for neighbor. And if we're kind of polluting the environment or trashing the environment around us, what does that say about how we care about others who we live alongside?
So it's an interesting. It's an interesting. I think this is one of those really interesting issues where there's clearly morality at stake here, right? There's a right and a wrong, and there's a sin and there's a righteousness, but it's not one that's necessarily tied to, do you compost or are you vegan or anything like that. There are different options for different people in different environments and different cultures and different places. But there does seem to be some mandate, as you've mentioned, that we're still the caretakers. We're still supposed to have dominion. And if we completely disregard that and completely ignore that responsibility and exploit the world and sit on our back porch and shoot birds with BB guns, I do think there's some moral dimension to that God's going to hold us accountable. Why did you kill all my birds?
I agree. Absolutely.
That's one of the reasons why what Tom was just saying about, the importance of kind of getting connected to nature and being out in nature. And, it's great fun, isn't it? Young people sort of learn, even if they haven't done that before, they very quickly learn that this is actually, it's hugely enjoyable.
Yes.
And that kind of consciousness raising is really important. And I mean, I see it throughout the scripture. I mean, so much of the Bible, so many of the illustrations that Jesus used in his parables, so much of what the psalmist writes about is drawn from nature, isn't it? It's observations of nature. It's look at these birds, look at these animals that God has made. God cares about this sparrow. Look at the fields, look at these flowers and how richly they're arrayed. All of these allusions. And sometimes I think we live in our kind of consumerist, sort of industrial society. We're closeted in our homes with our air conditioning, and all of our food is sort of plastic wrapped, and we're so disconnected from that pastoral world in which the biblical writers were living. And I think it would do us all good to rediscover some of that.
Absolutely. And there's so much research that has been done about people leaving the hectic lives. I don't know if you've ever heard of forest bathing, but the whole idea of getting into the forest, it's kind of a Japanese thing. But for me, it gets away from the gospel to a certain extent. But the research shows that if we can get away from the hectic life and get into one of God's forests, we're seeing blood pressures going down. We're seeing kind of this mindfulness perspective of just paying attention to the detail. From a Christian perspective, it's almost a time of worship. We're not worshiping nature. We're worshiping the God behind nature. That was a big transition for me too, because I was a nature worshiper before coming to Christ. And then I realized, there's no wonder there's something special out here. It's not nature itself. It's him behind it that is so exciting. And so just emotional well-being, physical well-being, just being out in it and just taking people out in it and introducing them, especially young people. I just love taking folks out, especially in the dark. That's the big one. The fear is huge. And yet, and that was just one of many stories where, wow, can we do that again? They weren't saying that at first. So it's just really special. So, yes.
It's an interesting point you bring up, the idea that, we sometimes look at the nature worshipers and we might think, and I've sort of derided them here in this podcast, but the idea that they're really onto they're seeing the glory of God.
Absolutely.
No, that's what they're seeing, but that's what they're seeing.
Yes.
Maybe we ought to be a little more inviting, like Paul on Mars Hill, and say, I see you have an altar to an unknown God. I see you're worshiping nature. Let me tell you why.
Right. Exactly right.
It's really interesting.
I'm with you. That's why I can so relate to them, because I was seeing nature exactly how they're seeing it. And there's something to it. And what I discovered was that it was Jesus. That's something. He's what's to it. He's what's behind it. And that's why I get along with all of these people so very well. I totally see where they're coming from. Used to work at a Wolf Center, for example. I work with Wiccans and pagans, and we all got along because I was actually invited to the pagan club to come and speak. And I was thinking, well, why not talk about bears? Why not? I mean, how many Christians get a chance to come to the pagan club and talk bears? And maybe I can slide a thing or two about Jesus in there. It fell through, unfortunately. But I was willing to go, but I totally can relate to the perspective. And I
didn't even know there was a pagan club. This is how
this was a pagan club at a local New York university. Neo-paganism seems to be pretty much on the rise, and it's very much nature worship and see a lot of it
diet,
in the UK, Europe. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. And so when I'm around these people, we're on the same page with regard to the care of nature. It's just there's a few more details that have changed for me.
Yeah.
So.
This has been a fantastic discussion, but we probably need to start winding things up. I mean, there are so many things we haven't touched on, and we could have done, and we could have spoken for a lot longer. And this has been absolutely fabulous. But what I did want to do before we sort of close out is recommend some resources to people. And I know all of us have got sort of favorite books and things that we've read. So, Tom, why don't you start and just tell us some of the resources that maybe you could point people to if they want to dig into this topic a bit more.
One of the books that I've read and enjoyed was Dr. Gordon Wilson's book, A Different Shade of Green. That's coming from a creation perspective. I know, Paul, you've got that there. Yep. There are many good stewardship books in the climate change area, not only from Christians, but from non-Christians as well. There are lots of papers. I say if you went to any of the Christian creation websites, you could Google stewardship and creation, and you'll find some good papers written on the subject, because there's not a lot of creationists writing a lot of books on this. And then there's a non-Christian book, which is a classic in the field, which is not coming from a Christian perspective, but it's a Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold. He's more of an ecocentrist. He's the father of wildlife biology. He's a forester, and but he's a wonderful writer. And I always have my students read that particular book, among others. So.
Great. Well, I have a resource I want to recommend. This, being the old curmudgeon that I am and have always been, this one really transformed the way I thought about environmentalism, really helped me to sort of come to terms with the alarming wing of environmentalism, and it's a book called Entrusted, and it's edited by Stephen Dunbar and Jim Gibson and Umberto Rassi. And this is a Seventh-day Adventist book, so if you haven't read Seventh-day Adventist literature before, this might be a little bit of a surprise. But they're Christian, and they give very good theological discussion about why we should care, because we're entrusted. That's the whole theme of it, that we've been entrusted with something that God made, and it's not ours to just mess up as we want. We need to use it responsibly and care for it. And so this is a really good book for me. I really enjoyed that book.
And I want to recommend this again. This is Tom's book that he co-wrote with Gene Leitner, the Ecology book, and it's a great resource. I think it's designed for families to use together, but I enjoyed reading it myself, and it's great. It's well illustrated. It's got a lot of fascinating information about ecology and ecosystems and biogeochemical cycles and biodiversity and lichens and bacteria and flowers and plants and everything. Wow. About ecology. It's fantastic, and there are some great ideas for practical things that you can do as a family, sort of exercises and things that you can do, practical things that can make a difference. So I really want to recommend that book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And Tom, we are very grateful to you for the time that you've given us today. It's been a fantastic discussion. And at some point, I guess we would love to have you back, and we'll talk about something different. Bears, maybe.
We're going to need to do that. I'm going to need to know if my cat's going to be in heaven. So that's
great.
Probably a future topic there.
Yes, perfect. Paul and Todd, thank you so much for having me on. It's been fun. I'd love to come on again and chat, whatever you want to. I'll deal with the curmudgeon. Yeah, we'll deal with it.
Yeah.
Good.
It's been
Fix me up, Tom. Man. Fix me up.
Take good care. We'll see you.
Okay. Yeah, you too. And as we close out, remember that you can check us out at coursesci.org/podcast, and you'll find there all of the information about the podcast, all of the various streaming platforms, as well as our show notes. You can send us an email. We love to hear from you. We want to have your feedback, your questions. And Todd, what's the email address?
It's podcast@coursesci.org. CORESCI.org. Podcast@coursesci.org. And don't forget, if you're watching this on YouTube, click that like button. Yep. And click that subscribe button. And, if you're on another platform, leave us a good review if you can. If you can't, don't. But if you can, do. That would be great.
And if you're enjoying the podcast, why not share it with others? And, share the episodes with your friends on social media. That would be great. Spread the word. And, of course, we can only keep our ministries going and keep the podcast going through the very generous support of people who make donations. So, Todd, how can people support Core Academy of Science? How do they do
All
it?
right. So Core Academy of Science, we're one of the sponsors. You can go to coresci.org/donate. And in fact, if you go to coresci.org, there will be a big button that says donate, and it will give you instructions on where you can send your checks, how you might give online. You can even set up a regular donation, $5, $10 donation. That's really how we survive and how we pay the bills and keep the lights on and keep this podcast coming.
Yep. And it's exactly the same for Biblical Creation Trust. We're absolutely dependent on the donations of people who want to support the work that we're doing. And if you go to our website, biblicalcreationtrust.org, again, there's a donate button on the homepage. It will take you to all of the options, whether you're in the UK or whether you're overseas. And there are various ways that you can give and support what we're doing. Well, that's about it. I'm not quite sure what's coming up in the next episode.
I don't know. I got some ideas, though.
Yeah, we've got some ideas, but it's going to be a bit of a magical mystery tour. So you're going to have to come back next time to find out, right? So we'll see you then.
All right.
Okay,
see
bye
you.
for now.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Let's Talk Creation. If you have questions, send them to podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org. And be sure to let your friends know about Let's Talk Creation. And check us out on social media. Thank you.